Good afternoon. My name is Linda Schottenstein Fisher, and I am the chair for the JDC Archives Committee. So nice to have you here. Thank you for joining us for what is the third in our lecture series. The program today will be led by Dahlia Wassner, and it is called Latin America and the Caribbean: Jewish Experience in the 20th Century. First, a few words about the archives. The JDC Archives, with locations in both New York and Jerusalem, houses the records of the organization since its creation over 100 years ago. The Archives is unparalleled in its repository of modern Jewish history. Its vast holdings document JDC's global humanitarian mission, its activities, and its partnerships from World War I to the present, and in so doing provides an exceptional perspective on JDC's global humanitarian work in over 90 countries where we operate. The world that we show is a great opportunity to study modern Jewish history, and visiting scholars from all over the world utilize our unique offerings for the research, as do publishers, journalists, genealogies, curators, filmmakers, and others. We invite you to check it out. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dahlia Wassner, who is the director of the Brandeis Initiative on the Jews of the Americas. She is the author of Harbinger of Modernity, Marcos Aquinas and the Democratization of Argentina, which was published in 2014. She's published her scholarship in numerous academic journals, including Contemporary Jewry, Iberian and Latin America Studies, Latin American Jewish Studies, Latin American Research Review, and Modern Jewish Studies. Dr. Wassner serves on many boards, including Latin American Jewish Studies Association Board of Directors, the Jewish Women's Archives Encyclopedia Editorial Board in the field of Latin America, and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry Board of Directors. The title of Dr. Wassner's lecture today is A Pre-Revolutionary Cuban Memoir and the Creation of Pan-American Jewish Organization. So our format will go as follows. Dr. Wassner will speak for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions for about 15 minutes. Please note that your microphones are turned off, you're muted, and we'll take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions anytime during Dr. Wassner's lecture. You do not have to wait till the end. So Dr. Wassner, thank you for being with us today, and I'll now turn the program over to you to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fisher. It's a great pleasure to be invited to share my work here at the JDC Archives. I would like to especially thank Isabel Rohr and Abby Lester for the warm invitation. And as Ms. Fisher mentioned, I am a historian of Latin American Jewry, and I'm the director of a new initiative at Brandeis called Jews of the Americas, where our goal is to grow awareness of the depth and breadth of Latin American Jewry, the multiple ways we are connected to the global Jewish diaspora as Mizrahi, Sephardic, and Ashkenazi Jews, and also to broaden notions of global Jewry and of Jewries of the Americas. And so it's wonderful to partner with such organizations as the JDC Archives in order to further knowledge in this field. So Isabel, if you could please open the slideshow, it would be a pleasure to share my research. So my talk this afternoon is based on some of my current research based on a memoir that's written by a member of one of the oldest Sephardic families of the Americas. The author is Jacob Brandon Maduro. His ancestors were among the tens of thousands of Jews, figures range between 10,000 and 150,000, who fled Spain and Portugal during the expulsions at the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century in the Iberian Peninsula. And Jacob's ancestors found new possibilities, as so many others did, in Amsterdam. And then they numbered among those Jewish families who found in the Dutch colonies in the Americas, mercantile opportunities alongside the freedom to practice their religion openly, which was not allowed in most of the colonized Americas as they were colonized by Iberian powers. So as I begin my talk, I want us to consider that when we think of diaspora, and as such, the accompanying evolution of peoplehood and identity, we of course must consider the connections that migrating people bring with them and also form in their new homes. Any study of migration of peoples includes the reasons and the conditions under which they move, from where they come, and the realities they encounter wherever they arrive. These all converge to form intricate new identities that emerge as necessary amalgams of the past and the present. Also, the local and transnational networks that are implicated in these migrations, that are at times renegotiated or formed anew as a result of migration, also comprise an important part of any dynamic diaspora. When, as historians, we're lucky enough to witness this process in real time, that of crafting a narrative where identity and purpose fuse to bear witness and make sense of a certain trajectory within larger historical narratives, well, in my opinion, that's like finding gold. So if we can move to the second slide, I've come to share with you just such a find present in a memoir that was written in 1954 in Havana, Cuba by Jack Brandon Maduro. Here you're seeing the family tree that he's a part of. As I mentioned, he's one of the first he's a member of one of the first Sephardic families that began to arrive in the Americas in the 17th century. And they can trace their ancestry actually 14 generations back to Spain and Portugal, then Amsterdam, and then the Dutch and Danish West Indies, or the Caribbean, specifically in his case, to Curacao and also St. Thomas. And these first Jews of the Americas, Sephardic Jews, who came not only to Curacao and St. Thomas, but other islands such as Jamaica, these are the founders of Caribbean Jewries, and also soon thereafter of coastal continental cities of the Americas, such as Colón, Panama, such as Newport, Rhode Island, Savannah, Georgia, even New York City. I would like to indicate a specific characteristic of these early American Jews who developed a family narrative that was germane to what we call in Jewish history port Jewries. I join here in studying port Jewries, a contemporary generation of scholars that has embarked on this important task of tracing early Sephardic settlements in the Americas, producing innovative frameworks for conceptualizing the trajectory of Jewish life across the region with an appropriate focus on the Caribbean. In fact, renewed scholarly attention has amplified current understandings of economic ties and institutional relations that existed between Jews in various American colonial lands, as much pertaining to those European powers that allowed and at times encouraged Jewish early modern settlement, and also that had an important role in the expanding diaspora iterations that were pursued primarily through maritime mercantile avenues. These new frameworks for understanding Caribbean Sephardic Atlantic Jewries carry also important implications for evolving notions of Jewish paths to modernity. In what was a path-breaking argument about triste Jewry published 20 years ago, Lois Dubin understood that a certain case study of Italian port Sephardim suggested a distinct path to modernity or cosmopolitanism that did not follow the Western European model of Haskalah or enlightenment that so many of us may be more familiar with. It was possible to reach a modern condition that involved access to economic, political, or civic participation. And Dubin expanded this realization to other locales beyond Italy, including Atlantic Jewries, which provided a really interesting hermeneutical historical tool with which to help bridge the gap between Jewish history in North and South America that actually involved a critical role for Caribbean port Jews. And this school of scholarship has suggested that Atlantic Jews serve as veritables harbingers of modernity, which is a term I used before in my scholarship, but this is not my own line. This is one that's attributed to Sorkin, who referred to port Jewish Jewry studies and maritime historiography as offering a welcome counterpoint to the Ashkenazification of modern Jewish history. In this framework, a reimagined centering of identity on ethnicity is applied to maritime diaspora trading alliances of Atlantic Jewry through the late 1800s, carries important implications for the modern period. So, as I wrap up this methodological framing, I do so with the suggestion that these academic dialogues have lent new paradigms for understanding Sephardic Jewish families who built networks of business and community, and in doing so, accompanied the subsequent emergence of American republics and nation states. I hope to show through a close reading of Jacob Brandon Maduro's 1954 memoir that was penned in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba, along with a study of relevant archives and community documents, that a cultural and intellectual approach to modern American Atlantic Jewish sources lends important implications for port Jewry scholarship and for maritime scholarship into the 20th century. Also, in so doing, it further challenges the boundaries of social science disciplines by reconsidering the substance and parameters of American Jewry. Okay, slide 3, please. As mentioned before, Jews were long valued for their expertise in trade and their ethnic networks that enabled their success. Jewries of the Atlantic and the Caribbean, like those of the Mediterranean before them, gained a measure of political rights and economic freedom in a symbiotic relationship that brought prosperity to these governments who encouraged the trade and relied on Jews' ethnic networks. The Panamanian-born author of the memoir I came across, Jacob Brandon Maduro, known by most as Jack, was a descendant of such a family. Here you have a picture of him in his youth, along with various of his writings, some of them compiled under miscellaneous writings, but they include poetry, and the memoir is a part of this collection. He reflected on his place in world history. And to my assessment, he understood his place in the Caribbean and the Americas in a post World War II context in a way that was very much informed by his legacy as a port Jew. What I was struck by as the most important aspect of Jack's memoir was the pride he reflected when narrating his service to Jewish transnational institutions and Jewish transnational activities, which he presented as an asset to the modern world that he saw as positively connected across networks of trade and friendship. When the narrative contradicted the modern realities of his day, whereby Caribbean and American nations to the south and east of the US were proclaiming their desires for autonomy and separation, Jacob continued to espouse the salience of networks across the Americas, including the US, networks such as those that had been instrumental to establishing the Atlantic Jewish diaspora in the first place, and networks that had helped form a modernity that was defined by cosmopolitanism. These legacies all dovetailed in the memoir that we'll study today, that I would argue is otherwise very much an aberration of its times. So let me explain. Who was Jack Brandon Maduro and how did his life play out? Jack Brandon was born in the Republic of Panama on August 4th, 1880. This was then part of Gran Colombia until its separation about a generation later. Jack was educated in New York at Dr. Fack's Collegiate Institute. His fondest memories of his childhood in Panama are recalled as Shabbat dinner, Friday nights at his grandmother Maduro's home, which he says happened religiously every Friday night, and allegedly no local member of the family was ever absent. The memoir importantly chronicles Jacob's family business in Panama, including the extraordinary respect that Jacob's father, David Brandon, garnered among Jews and non-Jews alike, due to his noteworthy contributions to the institutional foundations of the young country. For example, the memoirs describe David Brandon, Jack's father's involvement in tending to the wounded and the dead during the Belisario Porras Revolution, which led to Panama's independence from Gran Colombia. We learn of David's business acumen as a banker in Panama. We learn of his civic mindedness, including famously his involvement in founding the first firehouse of Panama. We learn of David's support of the independence coup that led to the independence of Panama. And David's funeral is corroborated by multiple sources and oral interviews as the first and only time that the cathedral bells ring for a non-Catholic in the country, and where Jews and non-Jews, people of all colors and races, reportedly mourned his father's passing. After the funeral, Dr. Manuel Amador Guerrero, the first president of Panama and a personal friend of David's, personally promised to look after his widow. Slide 4, please. In the center bottom is a photo of David Brandon. In the center, in the center is a photo of David Brandon, and his great grandson is standing in front of the firehouse. It still stands today and holds that very picture that you're seeing in the middle, in the central firehouse of Panama. Grant Brandon, David Brandon's great great grandson, and Jack Brandon's great grandson, and Jack Brandon's grandson accompanied me on a trip to Panama this past January 2023. And I understand he's on the call today as well. That picture is still hanging at the Central Firehouse in Panama. As I said, there is a stamp with the same picture on it, and I was also able to visit the cemetery where he is buried, along with so many others of the community that hailed from either Curacao or St. Thomas, mostly, as I mentioned before. So this presence in Panama today is but a small indicator of the widespread and well-documented Jewish involvement in the founding infrastructure of the state of Panama. If we can move to slide 5, these are other documents that I became privy to during my visit to the oldest Sephardic synagogue in Panama City, called Kol Shearit Israel. And where I was privileged to also give a talk of my research in its early stages. The memoir that we have uncovered reflects this trajectory of Sephardic Jewish families that came from Curacao and St. Thomas to build really the Jewish communities of Panama. And the memoir then goes on to trace Jack's life's trajectory, his marriage to a Sephardic woman from Bradford, Pennsylvania. Her name was Esther Steinberger. They returned together in the early days of their marriage to Panama. Then they returned to the US, to New York, and then New Rochelle. And finally, Jacob and Esther move in 1922 yet again, this time undertaking the relocation that would be of greatest longevity in bringing the family for over 30 years consecutively to Havana, Cuba. The family left only in 1960 in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Revolution. And family lore says that Jack Brandon Maduro passed away on the train from Miami to New York upon arriving from Cuba. As family legend has it, he passed away on that train of a broken heart for leaving Cuba. Slide 6, please. So these are documents that reflect the move to Cuba. The memoir outlines that it's in the Havana years that Jack's sense of responsibility would grow for the Jewish community, not only in Cuba, but also as enunciated throughout the Americas, repeatedly told in terms of a Pan-American entity that was most notably evidenced through Jack's own leadership in the Joint Distribution Committee, and also in bringing other organizations such as B'nai B'rith and his efforts to bring Hillel also to Cuba. What I found most striking was that the arguments that Jack employed in narrating his support of Jewish education and cultural organization on the island, they offered an explicit service of supporting a meaningful Jewish identity and a sense of peoplehood to be shared among all Jews in Latin America and the Caribbean as part of the Americas writ large, in an argument that was effected through an unabashed mixture of narratives that was borrowed from James Monroe and Jose Marti. As we will see in a moment in detail, these are two disparate and contradictory visions of America America that are themselves results of very different historical periods. For Monroe, we're speaking of 1823, for Martí, 1891. Yet they're employed in Jack's narrative of the mid 20th century. And they're used as an amalgam crafted to advocate as much for the validity of Jews in post independence Cuba, and for a post World War II transnational American Jewish network for Jews of the Americas. The narrative's unifying thread is an adamant call for a broadly conceived Jewish diasporic ethnicity pursued most urgently in response to World War II, its refugees crisis, the emergence of Cold War politics, and also the contemporary threat of too much comfort, as Jack saw it, that of acculturation among Latin American and Caribbean Jewries. In this context, the birth of the modern state of Israel also serves as an additional source of pride to be shared among the Jews of the Americas. So I'd like to walk you through how that plays out in the memoir. Here's some language, if we turn to slide 7, of how Brandon describes settling down in Cuba in the mid 1920s. Up to this time, there had been no visible signs of anti Semitism in Havana. The number of Jewish residents was small, and these were mostly of Sephardic origin, whose language was the Old Marrano, similar to that which was spoken in the time of Cervantes and which the Cubans seemed to enjoy hearing. He then goes on to say that the English-speaking and Sephardic Jews did not enjoy the dissonant note of the Yiddish Jews. We learned that there was an uptake in Ashkenazi immigration also in the 1920s that he was reacting to. So we actually could have a whole lecture just on that quote, but for in the purpose of sharing more, I'll just say that the authentication of Sephardic Jews in lands that used to be of Sephardic colonial powers, such as Cuba, was very common. And in fact, although Esther and Jack were moving from New York, and they lived with like the American expat communities, and particularly lived in Edificio Alaska, which is known as one of those buildings that housed the U.S. expat community of Jews. They were Sephardic Jews, and that granted them a certain legitimacy in these lands. And as you see in that quote, it was a claim that had a lot of weight. And as I am a student of Latin American Jewish literature as well, it's a claim that we see repeated throughout Latin American literature by Jews, regardless of when they arrived and regardless of their Sephardic provenance also. Ashkenazi Jews also used this to authenticate that there have been Jews in Spanish lands authentically for centuries. Okay, so Cuba is portrayed as a natural home to a Sephardic Jew like himself, and the designation could be extended to any Jews who were willing to learn the language and show respect for local customs, as long as they were willing to be grateful guests. The extent to which the argument is not concerned with the symbiosis or authenticity, however, but rather peaceful cohabitation, is a perspective more applicable to port Jewries. And here we'll see other examples further on of when Jack is not trying to further this argument of the Sephardic legacy in Cuba or in previously Spanish or Portuguese controlled lands of the Americas, but rather speaks of the validity just of an ethnic network of Jews in the Americas. So let's move to slide 8. I'll show you some more pictures so you have some visualizations of Jack's life, his family life in the Americas. He reflects in his memoir that he found the people of Cuba, rich and poor alike, and here I'm quoting, to be liberal-minded and friendly toward those who make a reasonable effort to understand them and work with them harmoniously. He writes, and I quote again, Cuba is a matchless land in many ways. It has magnanimous soil, a salubrious climate, and is free of poisonous flora and dangerous fauna, something which cannot be said of very many countries on earth. He also writes that after living for 30 years in the country, he's grateful for the life that he was able to make for him and his family, having raised his family with social and cultural distinction, he notes. So Jack is thriving in Cuba. He's happy, he's prospering. Um, and even if he made comments reflecting some early disdain for Ashkenazi Jews on the island in the 1920s and 30s, um, those were directed mostly at Jews coming from Poland and Russia, calling them uncouth, worrying that their Yiddish culture and language would be unwelcome in a land sympathetic to the Marrano language. But Jack also was one of a handful of Jews who worked, like I said, with the Joint Distribution Committee and the Cuban government to take in Jewish refugees sailing from Germany as World War II was brewing. And it was, in fact, this role that led Jack's involvement to expand, as I said, to B'nai B'rith and Hillel beyond the JDC. He served as a director of the Joint Relief Committee, which was funded by the Joint Distribution Committee from its establishment from 1937 to the end of 1938. And for his work in bringing refugees from Europe, even before the outbreak of the war, Jack was awarded the degree of Caballero, or Knight, of the Order in 1940 by Cuban President Federico Laredo Bru. He then headed the application for a B'nai B'rith chapter in Havana, which he reflected in his memoir, would be an international endeavor, one that would provide a link with U.S. Jewry alongside an affiliation with the Anti-Defamation League, whose fight against racial injustice was powerfully backed in Washington. And that was a quote, the affiliation with Anti-Defamation League. And so in 1948, Jack agreed to head the petition for B'nai B'rith based on his work with the Joint Prior, and was nominated unanimously to be the president of the B'nai B'rith Charter in Havana, which was named the Maimonides Lodge. We can move to slide number 9. And what is interesting is that in narrating his life trajectory, he also plants an intellectual map. In his public speech that he gave accepting his award for his work with B'nai B'rith in 1949, so this is about 10 years later, Jack invokes the figure of Jose Marti, again, the statesman revered throughout Cuba as having provided the collective purpose to this Caribbean nation where the shackles of colonialism would be finally thrown off and indigenous culture and knowledge would be celebrated in an authentic way. Like all good Cubans, the memoir shows Jack invoking Marti by name and also in style, waxing poetic and philosophical about his adopted home. And here I provide an example. Jack writes in his memoir, and his own words are then followed by an excerpt of Nuestra America, actually pasted in English translation into his own memoir. So here these are Jack's words. Although mankind is one genus in the order of nature, there exists in all native and inherited cultures an ethnic individualism which contributes in its own imagery, style, and rhythm to the symphony of the universe. We find the same quality of uniqueness in each snowflake, in the petals of each flower, in the lines of every human hand, in the unrepeated drapery of each sunset, indeed in every object that meets the human eye. By this means, universal intelligence manifests its infinite versatility and pours its glory into receptive minds among the children of men. Jack's own words, as I mentioned, are followed by an excerpt of Nuestra America. And I want you to keep this in mind as we turn to witness Jack's address when he was invited by the mayor of Miami Beach, Florida, named Harold Turk, to be the principal speaker at a 1949 meeting held at the Delano Hotel to, I quote, promote interest and inter-American understanding. And this was held under the auspices of the Miami Beach Lodge of B'nai B'rith. The invitation was delivered, like I said, by the president of the Anti-Defamation League. His name was Mr. Balkan. And at the meeting, the mayor of Miami, Mayor Turk, read excerpts of Jack's miscellaneous writings. And we know that the address was reported favorably in the local press. Jack was awarded the Freedom of the City Key, and he was done so along with Mr. Velasquez, who was at the time the Consul General of Cuba in Miami. This Consul General, Mr. Velasquez, we know, then visited Jack in Cuba and filed Jack's own speech at the Ministerio de Estado, or State Department in Havana, along with a report of the B'nai B'rith meeting. And in this speech, Jack explicitly and emphatically lauds Jose Marti, yet interestingly, he does so alongside James Monroe. And he also extols the virtues of the charters of the Anti-Defamation League and invokes B'nai B'rith's mission as examples to be followed, presenting them all as complementary philosophical and political entities aligned in strengthening inter-American alliances, which is a posture that Jack presents as necessary at the time of Cuba's independence half a century earlier. And now, in the late 1940s, after World War II, when the free countries of the West faced a call to band against the despotism of the East, otherwise known as the Cold War. And in so doing, Jack actually, I think, ignores the historical specificities of each of the tropes above, as well as their contradicting connotations within the Americas. And here we can turn to the next slide. Thank you, Isabel. So the fact that Martí was calling for an American and Caribbean brotherhood free from the US, while invoking Monroe, who famously called for an American hemispheric unity based on US hegemony, was possibly lost on Jack because they coincided on a different level, which was valuing an American network of allegiance. The Monroe Doctrine, as you may know, was a US foreign policy position that opposed US colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. It was enunciated first during President James Monroe's 1823 annual State of the Union address to Congress, though it would not be named after him until 1850, and it would not be recognized as central to US policy until the 20th century. But at the time of the Annunciation in 1823, many of the Spanish colonies in the Americas were working towards independence from their Iberian colonizers. When Monroe asserted that the New World and the Old World were to remain distinctly separate spheres of influence, and that any further efforts by European powers to control or influence sovereign states in the region would be viewed as a threat to US securities, the American states to the south of the US saw this as a big brother posture that was not understood as a reassurance, but as a renewed threat of colonialism, just when they were throwing off what they saw as the shackles of, Iberian colonialism, Spanish or Portuguese, in the early and mid 1800s. In contrast, Jose Marti, the great Cuban statesman who died in 1895 during the Spanish-American War, which was indeed the war that gained Cuba's independence from Spain, and by the same token ended Spain's global empire, Marti warned against American aspirations in the hemisphere and urged his fellow Cubans to seeking to dispossess Spain of its last colony to not throw off the mantle of one ruler for another. And in that effort, Martí extols the validity of that which was born in American soil over that born in Europe. He writes, no Yankee or European book could furnish the key to the Hispano-American enigma. From the Rio Bravo to the Straits of Magallanes, the great Semi, riding high astride a condor, has scattered the seeds of the new America across the romantic nations of the continent and the suffering islands of the sea. And I read this to you as you have the Monroe Doctrine in front of you so that you see the contrast. And as these two postures are, however, contradictory, there is, as I mentioned, an internal consistency that was authentic to Jack's sense of identity as a Cuban American Jew working for inter-American collaboration. Jack strings these disparate tropes together, not duplicatlessly, but rather, I think, authentically espousing the logic of a Port Jew legacy where networks of ethnic brotherhood in service of modernity across the oceans is admirable and useful and should be obvious to all friends of modernity. We can move to slide 11. And here we have a photograph already when Jack is after a decade of living in Cuba in front of a car and a beautiful home, obviously showing the success of the Cuban experiment, let's say. Um, so here I also quote from the memoir. I have been a resident of Cuba for more than 25 years. I'm happy to say that I have never been made to feel alien to the kindly and hospitable community in which I live. Quite to the contrary, as I have become more proficient in its rich and expressive language and have familiarized myself with its social philosophy, well tinted as it is with Hispanic tradition, I have arrived at the conclusion that despite outward divergences, there is a definite trend in the Americas toward cultural unification. Um, and he ignores that that didn't always include US. He, in that light of this perspective, promotes the extension of B'nai B'rith to Cuba. He argues that an example of why Cuba is such an apt place for B'nai B'rith to expand to is seen in the fact that UNESCO just designated Cuba for its Latin American branch headquarters due to its, and here I quote, strategic importance, and also out of appreciation on part of the statesmen throughout the world that the people of Cuba provide a wholesome psychological balance in the scale of inter-American solidarity. And we can move here then to slide 12. So for Jack, inter-American Jewish camaraderie and those economic, political, and cultural bonds upon which poor Jews historically staked their success and their utility now served another useful Western purpose of democracy on a global scale. He writes, "We proudly behold the increasing stature of B'nai B'rith in our own day as a competently trained field unit wherever danger threatens the social stability of any community in the Americas." And here you see both Monroe and Marti kind of coinciding in the argument, in my opinion. With these facts before us, we cherish the hope that this convention in a foreign, hospitable land will serve as a precedent for other conventions overseas, that it may prove to be the first span in a series of spiritual bridges across the waters which physically separate the peoples of the Americas, that one day not too far away we shall visualize the completion of the remaining spans of this structure, not made with hands, and dedicated as a memorial to the ageless longing for brotherhood in every human heart, reinforced by equal opportunity for each and every loyal citizen, whatever his race, color, or religious creed may be. And that quote I chose because it very much is not concerned with the authenticity of Jews having been in one land of the Americas or the other. It actually calls Cuba a foreign land, calls it hospitable, is focused on the networks between other lands that Jews can extend to. This is a Port Jew mentality. If we turn to slide 13, we get to a final picture of the Brandon Maduro clan in Cuba, taken the same year as the memoir was written in 1954. And as the address that I focused on from 1949, at the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Miami, in which the director of the Anti-Defamation League in New York invited Jacob Brandon to speak. That was obviously 1 year after the founding of the State of Israel. And what is interesting also, and I'll end with this note, is how does the memoir cover the creation of a modern state of Israel, and how does that gel with the Sephardic Atlantic port mentality? It turns out that at first in the memoir, Jack initially refers to Jewish immigration and also monetary support for Israel in terms of some competition, a bit of frustration that Cuban Jews and others may be raising funds for Israel rather than local or even inter-American needs. And we can turn to slide 14. once the establishment of the state of Israel becomes more certain, within 5 years of the establishment, when it became clear that his audience in Cuba and his allies in the US that were interested in bringing organizations like the Joint and B'nai B'rith and Hillel to the Americas, Jack's tune toward Israel changes, and he actually dedicates a chapter of his memoir to the founding of the state of Israel, saying that there's not a day that goes by that he doesn't think of the importance of the founding of Israel. He lends comparison to Israel and the US as honorable partners to peace with their neighbors, and as partners in enhancing global Jewish peoplehood. He writes, at this point, Jews the world over need no longer suffer the pangs of religious self-consciousness and social frustration. This new virile community, heir in part to 2,000 years of dispersion, suffering, and tragedy, reminds us of the extraordinary fact that the Jews as an ethnic group have never surrendered or outlived their sense of responsibility. He, in fact, talks about the fact, he goes on to say that it's not the religion itself, but the ethnicity and the ethnic ties of the Jews that are seeing here played out in the establishment of the state of Israel, which was key to the Port Jew mentality. And I wanted to just close by way of conclusion to reflect that this amalgamated narrative where Jacob Brandon Maduro invokes both Jose Marti and James Monroe and extols the virtues of the missions of B'nai B'rith and the Anti-Defamation League and UNESCO, all sort of in one same breath, um, is consistent with a Port Jewish posture in which ethnic connections, when coterminous rights to economic, entrepreneurship, civic involvement, cultural participation, and transnational Jewish communal organization, all work together and can even involve multiple migrations. The nation is not the key factor, but rather the network. And as a Sephardic Atlantic Jew, I would argue that Jack Brandon Maduro embodied the very bridge between the world that he traversed and the emergence of the state of Israel figures not as an end to diaspora, nor as a challenge to it, but rather as a symbiotic indicator of the legitimacy of the Jewish people as valuable partners in a modern world that was now newly divided in two during the Cold War, where Jack's role in fighting forces of despotism through ethnic networks of progress found a renewed legitimacy and were able to base themselves on all these disparate contemporary tropes. So with that, I'm very happy to take questions and comments. I thank again the JDC Archives for inviting me, and perhaps as Isabel and Linda help feed some of the questions. I did want to briefly share that we'll have another upcoming chance at convening together when the JDC Archives and the Jews of the Americas at Brandeis co-sponsor a workshop in May this year, where we'll be hosting the JDC Director of Latin America, Sergio Witter, to give our keynote address at the workshop. And that will be in person and open to public, the keynote address, and also it will be recorded. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Wassner. That was a informative and fascinating lecture. So I appreciate you being here. And there are some questions in the chat, which we're going to tackle right now.
Great.
One actually is what I was thinking. Why did Jack and Esther move to Cuba instead to their original home of Panama?
For entrepreneurial opportunities. So the family had connections in throughout the world, and Jack does talk in his memoir of his trips to different parts of Europe, including Paris and Holland, Jamaica, There were outposts really that did connect across the Atlantic, family business. And he saw at the turn of the century this opportunity, really in the 1920s, in Cuba, an opportunity for Jews, and for him as he followed in the family business of clothing, like in the tactile trade, and so it was really that trade that brought him to Cuba. And actually, the first outwardly practicing Jews of Cuba were U.S. Jews that saw with the independence of Cuba a mercantile opportunity. But yeah, Jack continued kind of in the footsteps of his forefathers, let's say, and was actually in Europe when World War One breaks out and responds to that in his memoir as well.
At its peak, how many Jews were living in Cuba?
Um, at its peak, that is a great question, and I don't have that number handy. I know people have asked right now. The number dwindles to less than 1,000, and most of the current Jewish community in Cuba are supported by international Jewry. And we have a lot of cases of people that were born to one Jewish parent marrying a local person that converts to Judaism. And so the local Cuban Jewish community is kind of this new entity that is not exactly even a remnant of what was before, but more of a guardian of it.
Thank you. Yitzhak Karam asks, are there any comments by Jack of the St. Louis boat tragedy and the rejection of the European refugees coming to Cuba?
It's not commented in the memoirs, but obviously that was worldwide news. And I think that his efforts to be involved were also kind of unique in the case of the American Jews in Cuba and helping refugees come to Cuba. So it's not addressed.
Thank you. Stephen Burstein asks, did Jacob leave Cuba after the revolution? And what was his perspective of the revolution? Was there any writing that can enlighten us on that?
Yeah, so the memoir is written in 1954, but he does have other miscellaneous writings and in interviews with his descendants. So, yes, he leaves in the immediate aftermath of the revolution in 1959, at the end of the year. And so in 1960, the family leaves and actually leaves all of their possessions behind. They had established, like many middle class people, sometimes a comfortable living, and many of them had to leave everything that they had behind. And the interviews that I had with his family members reveal that it was a truly kind of sad abandonment of the island, and the family was moving on to Mexico actually, and that he died in the really traversing on the train upon landing in Miami, um, of a broken heart is what they say. So I think that they really saw their future there, and they were not. They were supportive of cosmopolitanism and yes, we're not uh, um, partners to the revolution.
And how old was Jack when he passed on the train? Do you
Yes,
know?
he would have been 80.
Okay. So
Yes.
pardon my pronunciation.
Hmm.
Lisa Carlson asks, is Nicolas Maduro, leader of Venezuela, part of the Maduro family? I have read that he was Sephardic, Jewish on one side of his family, paternal, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So if you read these family maps, like the one that I presented towards the beginning of my slideshow, these names, Maduro and Brandon, Fidenki, there's many names on these trees that repeat. There was actually also a lot of intermarriage, and many of these early Caribbean Jews end up marrying out and losing their religion. And so you have this huge legacy of once there's actually a great book by Josette Goldish Capriles of the Curacao Jewish community. She writes Once Jews, and she talks about some of these networks and how many of these descendants are no longer Jewish. And so the Maduro family had many branches, and I'm not sure exactly where he would have connected, because there's also a repetition of names. And so you actually have to do a very detailed study in order to be able to identify each particular descendant, and make sure that you're on the right branch, like I said, because there's so much intermarriage and also repetition of names.
Thank you. We have a question from Rosa Perlmutter. Could you speak about the manuscript, why it was never published, and do others mention it?
Yes, so I have been trying to answer that question, and in fact, I'm looking to publish it myself with annotations. We don't know, and I actually don't have even an original. I have a photocopy, and I've been trying to locate an original version of the manuscript in speaking to the descendants, and we've been unable to locate one. We don't know why it was not actually published. And it was dedicated to his children and grandchildren so that they would know the story, of not only Jack as the father or the grandfather, but also I think of the family, and how that fit into a narrative of the world. And also, Jack was, like I said, a prolific writer, and he wrote poetry and he wrote other writings that seems to have all kind of stayed within the family. People that study the Joint Distribution Committee in Cuba will note that Jack is mentioned specifically for his role in the 1930s in helping German refugees seek a haven in Cuba. And so his name is mentioned, but I haven't seen other mention of the memoir by other scholars or writers.
Thank you. Marilyn Miller just let us know that the population maximum was about 15,000, and she thanks you for a great talk. And did you find any work done in Ladino?
Oh, that's interesting. And the other thing that I did want to add in terms of numbers is that at the time that Jack was writing, the estimated population of Jews in the US was 4.5 million, which I think is an interesting number. And that contrasted with 1 million Jews of all of Latin America and the Caribbean, but that's already a significant number. And so I did want to show that the efforts that Jack was undertaking to bring B'nai B'rith and Hillel and the Joint not only to Cuba but to the rest of Latin America is because there was a significant population. In terms of Ladino, that is interesting. I didn't. These Ladino is more was not maintained by these families who left the Iberian Peninsula in the 1500s or early, I'm sorry, in the early 1500s or late 1400s, that then came to the Americas, usually through Amsterdam or sometimes through the Mediterranean. Ladino was more kept by the Sephardic immigrants to the Mediterranean basin or maybe the Balkans that that maintained Ladino or some kind of a Judeo-Spanish, and there are certain variations between them that maybe stayed on that side of the Atlantic. It wasn't brought over until the 20th century when you also have modern Sephardic immigration from the Mediterranean basin and from other, Turkish lands. There you do see Ladino come, but not in this context. and not, and not in this population of Sephardic Jews of the Americas.
Thank you. Grant Brandon, it's nice to have you on this call. And he just has reiterated that Jack was 80 and he did, in fact, die of a broken heart. So thank you for adding that. And also mentions that the Venezuelan leader is just a distant member of the Maduro family. We have a question from Margalit Bajarano. Thanking you for your fantastic, fascinating presentation. And she's adding, from what I know, Jacob Brandon was an exception in the small group of the Caribbean Jews who were more assimilated. Can you say anything about other Jews from Curacao, from Panama, or other communities?
That were in Cuba. So there, yes, I think that I do know some members of those families. And when I was in Panama about a year ago, I did meet with them. Many of them were much more assimilated, and I understand really kind of kept to themselves. And that was true for the Sephardic Jews of the Caribbean / Panama that were in Cuba. And it also is true of the Cuban Jewish community in general, that it was pretty divided between the Americans, of which the Sephardic Jews tended to be a part of because many of them came at some point through the US, and then the Ashkenazim that came first from Poland and only later from Germany. Mostly Poland, some Russia, and then later from Germany. And then there's a Turkish immigration that also begins after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And all of these communities basically kept to themselves. And the Caribbean Jews in general, not just the ones in Cuba, do have a very high level of assimilation and lack of affiliation. And in fact, we see this reflected in Jack's memoirs because he talks about at some point his own resistance to getting involved in the Jewish community, but then we see him kind of narrate this sense of responsibility to his Jewish brethren and to be a positive force in whatever community that he's a part of. But I agree with Professor Bejarano that this is more of an aberration than a reflection of a larger kind of communal involvement.
Thank you. So we have time for just a couple more questions. Amy Kerner has two questions. Do you consider the Port Jew mentality continuously relevant between its emergence and the 20th century, or does it disappear and then reappear at particular junctions, such as in this case, the Cold War?
That is a great question. I think it depends. I think that
maybe if I ask her second question, that'll help put
yes,
it
yeah.
into perspective. She says, and perhaps a continuation of the previous question regarding the revolution. Do Cuban Jews or Jews in Central America have a particular response or reaction to the US Cold War interventionism in Latin America, such as the US support for the 1954 removal of Arbenz in Guatemala?
Yes. Okay. So the Cold War in Latin America is an entire field of study. And yes, there were very important intellectual, political, and economic reverberations in Latin America that led to much resistance to US intervention, to a very interesting way that kind of what were deemed socialist or communist leanings in Latin America that may or may not have been connected to European powers were interpreted and acted upon by the US. And so, yes, the Cold War in Cuba and Latin America had very deep and profound effects. And I think getting to the first question, I think that we have not been paying as much attention to the Port Jew mentality. I think when we talk about either US Jewry or American Jewry, if you go to the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island, and if you study the beginnings of the Jewish communities of New York City or of Savannah, Georgia, you will see documents that very much tell the story of how they're connected to Curacao, of how they're connected to their Sephardic um, um, uh, brethren, but also networks. And I think that for more often than not, that perspective has been much more valuable. And I would say it's a much more modern perspective that is maybe more influenced by certain Ashkenazi trends, also in academia, that has maybe not asked some of these questions as often. So I don't think that it's gone away. I think we just haven't been paying as much attention.
Thank you. So we have time just for one more question, and I'll preface this by adding something else that Grant Brandon has added to our post. He said his grandpa did not create the memoir for publication, but rather as a memoir of the family history. He was a very modest man, which we can tell by his writing. That being said, Judy Creeth wants to know, is there a way to read some of Jacob's writings? Is it archived through JDC or anyone else in an accessible form for further research? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think Judy. So Judy is a filmmaker of a film called that the JDC also helped support, called Cuba's Forgotten Jewels. That also talks about this instance in the actually during the war when, which is not related to Jack's involvement in bringing the refugees, in which Cuba served as a haven through the diamond trade. And the film is beautiful, and I highly recommend it. The memoir has been gifted to the Brandeis University Library through the Jews of the Americas program. And so it is now actually digitized and available through the Brandeis Library in its raw form. And like I said, we're working on a publication to make it more broadly available and so that it can be known popularly and also then used for further scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wassner. This was an incredible presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did too. This has been recorded and it will be available in about 2 weeks' time on the JDC website if you want to share it or want to revisit it, and we welcome you do so. Just remind everyone our next webinar will take place on April 3rd. Julie Dawson, who is a recipient of the 2023 Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship, will give a lecture entitled "Uncertainty is a Torture Impossible to Bear for Long," examining Jewish life in post-war Romania. You can register, for it via the JDC Archives website and the link that is just got put up in the chat. So thank you for that. And we hope that you will be able to join us. And don't forget to sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for any of these public programs. We know they are a great source of information and very well received, so we are happy to do it. Again, thank you all for joining us. And again, Dr. Wassner, thank you for your incredible presentation and appreciate everyone being here. Thank you.